Imposters. I grew up in a pretty affluent town on the North Shore of Long Island, Locust Valley. It was Gatsby territory, the literal Gold Coast setting of F. Scott Fitzgerald's seminal novel about class, social structure, and the American dream. Growing up there in the 80s, there were still vestiges of the Gilded Age society that gave the area its fame. I had friends who were descendants of the storied families of the past, who still lived in their ancestors' robber baron mansions, or at least the glamorous outbuildings that still stood long after the largest spreads from Nick Carraway's days had been razed. The values from back then somehow lingered with them. It was a very status-conscious town. In the same way Tom and Daisy's crowd sought to marginalize the likes of Jay Gatz, Locust Valley's old guard worked hard to sniff out bounders and social climbers, to keep them from infiltrating their exclusive ranks. There was an elaborate code, a series of unspoken signs and symbols that dictated all acceptable behavior, from the fork you picked up to gobble down your saumon meunier, to the style and brand of underpants you were expected to wear. It was oppressive. It was impossible to be yourself. Whether you were trying too hard or not hard enough, you always felt like some kind of imposter. My best friend Peter Shannon lived in the neighboring town of Oyster Bay. The North Shore was still pretty rural back then, and it was a good 25-minute drive from his house to mine. Oyster Bay seemed like a different world to me. I'm not saying we looked down on it, the way the East Eggers looked down on West Egg. I never felt my friend from Oyster Bay suffered that West Egg need to prove he was somehow something he wasn't. But in the summer of 1985, when I was 14 years old, Oyster Bay seemed dangerous. It wasn't the large blue-collar community of teenagers roughhousing at the summer fair. That was exciting to me. Italian kids shoving each other around in the streets with a thick Long Island accent we private school kids were assiduously taught to avoid. No, what made Oyster Bay seem dangerous to me was the rash of car thefts my friend Peter's family had endured during that same summer. Every couple weeks, it seemed, the family woke up to find that their car had been stolen right out of their front driveway. They usually found it a few hours later ditched in the woods nearby, tags removed, but otherwise unharmed. The police were baffled. It seemed they were being targeted, toyed with. I imagined a band of marauding teenagers, something right out of A Clockwork Orange, terrorizing the poor family with the implicit threat of further violence. In my mind, it was only a matter of time before the situation escalated and they found themselves victims of a full-blown home invasion. The threat to me was not just an abstraction. My parents had divorced the year before, and my mother and stepfather had moved into a Gilded Age spread of their own, a large brick pile perched on a ridge above Long Island Sound. It was cavernous and grand, and in my parents' mind, in deep need of extensive repairs, which they undertook with a fury and efficiency that was nothing short of a military campaign. In hindsight, I imagine they were racing time, trying to make up for the lost years when they had been married to other people, trying to quickly build a happy foundation for our new blended family. They constructed a new driveway, moved the swimming pool, and built a pool house and tennis court, all while conducting a gut renovation of the giant main residence. The only room left untouched in the entire spread was the bedroom where I lived. When the kitchen was demoed, they moved a fridge and toaster into the upstairs hallway outside my room, and I lived on a diet of frozen pizza bagels and ice cream. At various points in the process, my mother and stepfather would get sick of the whole thing, their own suite of rooms undergoing a massive renovation, and fuck off to Europe for a while. I'd be left alone in the empty, half-destructed mansion overseen mostly by the Peruvian handyman, Blasson. Blasson was a few years older than myself, whippet thin with long, stringy hair and an insouciant swagger. He lived in the caretaker's cottage, and his job, when not taking care of the house, was mostly to drive me to school in the morning and ferry me around to various after-school activities. He hated it. I played ice hockey back then, and sometimes we would have to leave the house at 6 a.m. on a frigid winter morning to make it to the rink on time. Blasson was never on time. I would have to call him up on the landline from the wood-paneled library downstairs and beg him to drive up to the main house to take me to school. "Nikki," he would moan, "it is too early for this." And then we'd go hurtling through the icy back roads of Locust Valley, our big Buick estate wagon floating dangerously around the curves as Blasson rested his head on his shoulder, trying to catch a few winks on the straightaways. It would have been funny if it wasn't so damn scary. To be fair, I did not spend that many nights alone in that giant house. There were really only a handful where I sat cowering in my bedroom as I listened to the phantom sounds of a violent home invasion unfolding on the floors below. My father still owned my childhood home, and it was only a half-dozen miles away, and he and my stepmother came out from the city almost every weekend. I'd decamp to there and plot my teen adventures from my old bedroom. When my dad wasn't in town, I would sometimes go and live at my friend Peter's house in Oyster Bay, staying there for a week or so from time to time. His sweet mother would make us French fries and do my laundry and ferry us back and forth to school like brothers. Peter and I would spend endless hours in their basement playroom, pounding the flippers on their old school pinball machine. With their nuclear family still intact, sojourns at their house felt like a sweet respite from the chaos of my own family life. Cozy nights in their yellow farmhouse tucked down a forested drive at the top of a long private road. Despite the rash of car thefts, it was a place where I always felt safe. But when my mother's house was finally finished, we started to spend more time there. The place had a huge built-out basement with a giant screen TV, a movie theater popcorn machine, and an authentic arcade-style video game booth, right out of silver spoons. It was fun, but despite my parents' wholehearted attempt to make me feel at home, I always felt like an imposter there, hurling a closet full of someone else's shirts in my friends' faces. It wasn't my life I was living. I was some foundling plucked from the streets of Bangalore, draped in princely vestments, and tucked in the empty room of some runaway heir. There were times, though, when I felt completely myself. The family of one of my good female friends was building a house across the street, and sometimes Peter and I would sneak out and meet up with other kids in the framed-out shell, climb the plywood stairs to the second floor, and smoke butts and drink pilfered beers and watch the sunrise. It was glorious reveling in my newfound adolescent agency. I felt like I was on the set of The Last Tycoon. Sometimes I felt I was the last tycoon. One night when there were no other kids around, my mother's place was at the end of a long private road. Peter and I decided to entertain ourselves by popping my mom's racing green Jaguar XJ6 into neutral and pushing it down the drive far enough away from the house that no one could hear its roar when we fired up its engine and went joyriding up and down the long private road. It was a rush unlike any I had experienced to that point in my life. The audacity of the crime, mixed with the raw power of the car we were driving, made for a cocktail that was completely intoxicating. We were addicted immediately, and it became the secret thrill we both looked forward to all week long. The first time we did it, we barely left my driveway. I was just too scared, too excited, like a virgin on my first night of sex. I was ready to blow my load before we'd even begun, and Peter allowed me to relent. But with each subsequent foray, we got more adventurous. And it wasn't long before we started talking about taking the car out on the actual streets to meet up with friends when our parents were asleep. We hatched the first plot over lunch one Sunday at our parents' beach club. We were sitting around a table of half-eaten club sandwiches, paper bowls of ice cream, and chocolate sauce, flirting with some girls from our 8th grade class. We were all eager to hook up that night, not in a sexual way, but that too, but couldn't come up with a plan. Peter offered that we'd come to their house, and we could all hang out in their pool house once their parents were asleep. The girls wondered at how we'd get there, but Peter and I just shared a secret look. Getting there would be the exciting part. They didn't need to know the details. We'd figure that out. And later we'd decide that Peter could sleep at my place, and we would steal my father's car as soon as he went to bed. It wasn't the best plan because my father had a gravel driveway. It was noisy, and his room was close to where the cars were parked. But we were reckless. It also helped that no one suspected us. But then it turned out that Peter's parents had plans for him that night, so he couldn't come over to my place to sleep. Our plot was spoiled. But once he was done with his meal, and we began the nightly ritual of phone calls and conference calls that marked the unfolding of every single teenage evening I remember from that era. I don't remember what we all talked about back then, but it was relentless and relentlessly entertaining. You'd dial up one friend and then patch in another and call some other friends, and the conversation would rollick around the countryside from one house to another, legends built and debunked and reassembled, until it was time for bed. Peter and I were soon on the phone with a house full of girls, and then our impulses had the best of us, and we were suddenly making a plan to steal a car and go meet them. The thing was, we couldn't steal my car because my dad was still up. Peter's car was a good 25-minute drive from my house. We had never driven on the open road before, let alone unaccompanied on a route that would originate in the dangerous turf of Oyster Bay, make the steep climb over the palisade of Mill Neck, and somehow descend into Locust Valley. Peter didn't care. He was going to make this happen. Now, I knew my friend Peter had a big dick. It was the kind of thing you learned about your friends as you got older and started getting naked with girls. Suddenly, the characteristics of your private parts were fodder for lunchroom gossip. Peter's endowment had quickly become the stuff of elementary school legend. If I'm completely honest, I'd caught a glimpse of it once when we were peeing next to each other at the urinal. It was one of those moments in my life where I was suddenly confronted with evidentiary data that challenged my foundational conception of reality. Was I the normal one, taking a casual pee in my dick clasped lightly between thumb and forefinger? Or did all guys have to use an entire fist of digits to keep their slab of trunk meat peeing in the right direction? The question would haunt me for much of my adolescent life. Well, I had discovered at that urinal that at least one dude I knew was built like that. I had no idea he had these kinds of balls. But a little while later, as I was standing in the kitchen with my father, Peter made it to our side of town. We lived in a rambling farmhouse that sat right against the fence line of a heavily trafficked road, a thoroughfare from the village to the main artery leading into New York. My dad and I were eating a late-night snack as I humored the old man in hopes he'd make his way to bed. but it was moving slower than I hoped. When a blistering car horn sounded from the street as a car streaked by our house, its driver leaning on it for the full length of our property. Honk! My dad looked up at me in shock and bemusement. "What the hell is that?" he said, and we shared a shrug. But then it came back. The driver must have circled around, and he was buzzing our house again like Maverick and the control tower. My father, in one of those psychic parental moments, quipped, "Bet that's Petey, right?" And we both shared a big laugh at the absurdity of the idea. But I knew to my horror, he was right. Of course, we didn't have cell phones back then. There was no way I could let Peter know that my dad was still awake. I decided to force my father's hand and call it a night. There was an added bonus to this strategy. My room was actually perched over the road, its pair of easterly facing windows catching the light of passing cars and throwing them into my bedroom. I'd fall asleep to this duet, two identical rectangles of light dancing across my ceiling. I hoisted one of them open and hung my head out the window and waited for the car to pass by again. It slowed as it returned, and of course, it was Peter. He pulled up below our house. "What the fuck are you doing?" I whispered at him. But he was undaunted, grinning like a convict who just escaped the pen, high on his midnight flight across the plains. "My dad is still awake." But Peter just cackled and peeled off down the street. I sat in the dark hallway leading to my room, watching for the box of light that poured up from the kitchen to click out. Eventually it did, and I scampered to my desk to peer over the other side of the house to watch for signs my dad had retired. Once I could see his silhouette gliding back and forth behind the old bubbled glass of his sitting room, I made my move. Our house didn't have an alarm system, and we never locked our doors, so sneaking out wasn't terribly difficult. My biggest challenge was to just avoid the creakiest floorboards that were everywhere in that old house. But my dad's room was far from the kitchen, and I just crept down the back staircase and slid out the door in the laundry room. Peter rolled up almost as soon as I reached the end of our driveway, and I jumped into his parents' Honda, and we pulled off. The house where the girls were staying was maybe a mile or two away. It would take us less than 5 minutes to get there, and we were giddy with the promise of impending success. All we had to do was make it to the end of my road, turn left onto 25A, the old route into the city before the freeways had been built, and drive a quarter of a mile uphill on the old highway. There was only one hitch, one that, to be perfectly honest, we hadn't really considered. At the corner of my road and the old highway, there was a traffic signal, and beneath the traffic signal sat our local police station, a two-room building as sleepy as you might expect in our one-horse town. It was 11 o'clock at night on a quiet Saturday. There was no reason to think the police would be out in force. In fact, I'd never seen any activity at that cop station in the 10 years we had lived on that road, and blessedly, this night was no exception. The place looked deserted as we rolled up to the crossroads. But just as we neared the single intersection between us and our goal, the traffic light turned red. We had no choice but to stop and sit in our car, proverbial sitting ducks, before the predatory gaze of the police station, squatting on its haunches in carnivorous wait. Time had never moved so slow. Even in my memory, as I turned to Peter, now cast in the sick red glow of the traffic light, I can feel my own nausea, adrenaline constricting the opening of my throat. "What do we do?" he asked, panic welling in his eyes, his shoulders rising to his earlobes in a desperate shrug. In moments like this, even when you're wrapped up in the fury of the crisis, you know your behavior will define your character for years to come. Will you, like the subject of Rudyard Kipling's seminal poem, If, keep your head when all those about you are losing theirs? Or will you crack under the pressure and dissolve in a pool of blubbering tears? I have found over time that I tend to be a pretty cool customer when gripped in the vice of pressure. I've come to see the slowing of time as a boon, an opportunity for me to gather my wits and be clear-headed and decisive. That evening was no exception. I didn't hesitate. "Run it," I commanded, with hardly a second thought. Peter stepped on the gas and the Honda lurched into the intersection. He pulled the wheel to his left. In a few smooth seconds we were through. We'd done it. We cackled with excitement, giddily realizing our pubescent bravado had triumphed decisively over common sense. We moved steadily down the highway, and we were within hundreds of yards of the sanctuary of the girls' driveway when the unmistakable flicker of the red and blues lit up the cabin of our car. It was the police. We were getting pulled over. We shrieked in terror, recognizing instantly that our lives as we had known them were quickly coming to an end. What do we do? What do we do? What do we do? We knew we had no choice. We had to pull over, and the only place to put the car off the road was, of course, the driveway of the house where we were headed. We were about to get arrested and busted by our friend's parents. What do we do? What do we do? What do we do? It was my turn to look to my friend in terror. I don't know if it's clear from my description of myself at the urinal, but I had barely begun puberty at this point in my life. I remained baby-faced deep into my 30s, still getting carded at business dinners where I was the one picking up the tab. In 1985, midway through my 14th year, I looked like I was maybe 12. While Peter's voice had changed, and he was clearly exhibiting other signs of nascent virility, he was a short guy, an angelic blonde who was also cursed, or blessed, with a baby face for life. It was clear to me the cop would take one look at us and immediately call our mommies. "Let me handle this," Peter said to me, suddenly and completely in total control. The cop strolled up to the driver's side window and shined his flashlight in our pale, smooth mugs. He gave us a solid once-over, and I waited expectantly, unbreathingly, for him to call our bluff. "You know why I'm pulling you over, right?" he said, and Peter nodded. "You blew right through that traffic light." "Yes, officer," Peter conceded. "I'll need to see your driver's license and registration." Peter fumbled in the glove compartment, and I tried to help, but my fingers had gone numb, and my brain was no longer functioning. I couldn't imagine what was going to happen next, and I was now just a spectator to this horrible episode. "I don't have my license," Peter conceded. "I left my wallet at home." Oh my God. I realized he was going to try to perpetuate this charade and see how far he could bluff his way through. It seemed totally insane to me. How had he learned to so smoothly slip into the role of the imposter? The cop, again, took the measure of us both, shining his light a second time inside our car, and then made a decision that I will marvel at for the rest of my life. "Okay," he said, "just give me your date of birth." And Peter, in a display of cool that will always confound me, coughed up his actual date of birth, with a birth year that would have made him 17 years old. The cop returned to his car. Peter and I stared at each other, trapped in a silent purgatory. We didn't dare utter a peep. I kept running my sweaty palms down my thighs, and my cords were now streaked with sweat. We were in this. It seemed impossible to believe we might prevail, but we had no choice but to see it through. The cop returned to the driver's side door. His flashlight blared again into our mugs, blinding us a third time, disorienting us, softening us up for the kill. "I'm writing you up," he said. "I got to give you a ticket for running the light, and for the belt." I didn't understand what he was saying, and he could see it on my face. "You weren't wearing your seatbelt," he explained to me, apologetically. "I'm also going to have to write you up for the license. You can't drive without it," he explained. Again, I was totally confused by this statement. "But," he added brightly, "if you just bring your actual driver's license down to the station at your earliest convenience, we'll expunge the ticket." Oh my God. I realized he actually believed Peter had a license. He handed us the 3 citations, tapped the roof of the Honda, and sauntered back to his car. I wish I could say we were elated. We had just circled a powerfully destructive black hole and somehow been spun from the event horizon back into outer space. But our ship was severely damaged by the encounter. We were tentative and shaken as we hobbled back onto the road and crept slowly beyond the flickering glow of the cop lights, their nightmare hue receding behind us. We took the first left off the highway, crept down the narrow wooded lane, and then made another quick left, circling back toward my father's house. We were terrified the whole time, thinking the cop might have second thoughts and come arrest us after all. But when no one pursued us down the third road, we decided to pull over and finally exhale. We sat in the Honda with the cab light on and studied the tickets. As a full-grown adult, I still struggle to understand the directives on a traffic citation. But back then, it was total gibberish. We had no idea what to do with them or even what they were telling us to do. So sure, it was good we were not in jail. It was good our parents had not been called, our true natures revealed to the people who loved us and trusted us most. But what now? We had no bank accounts. We couldn't write checks. Also, we didn't have the license itself to get ourselves out of trouble. The police had our address. At some point, the truth would come out. At some point, our gooses would be cooked. Still, the car and tickets were in Peter's name, so there was a world in which he could protect me from all this if he chose. I would be at his mercy, but I was determined to do what I could to buy some goodwill. As I mentioned up top, my parents largely left me to my own devices. They were remarried and in love, and in fairness to them, I appeared to have my shit together. I may have been unsupervised, but I was not unsupported. I had Blasol, and there was also a cook at our house, a terrifying middle-aged ham of a woman who dyed her hair an incongruent jet black, Tex as we called her. I was fed and driven, and my parents made sure I always had plenty of cash, wads of cash. I had so much cash there were rumors running around my elementary school that I was dealing drugs. I reached into the pocket of my cords and pulled out a handful of crumpled up hundies, an absurd amount of money for a 14-year-old to be carrying in the 80s. Let alone wadded up with a bunch of bubblegum wrappers and lint. I wasn't sure what Peter could do with the money, but I hoped quixotically that if we shoved the bills in some envelopes with the tickets, maybe the whole thing would just go away. I lay in my bed that night praying to God for mercy, bargaining with God for what I'd give up if only he'd let me get off scot-free. I'm not sure when this became my default response to a crisis, but it has continued with me well into adulthood. I still wake up regularly at 3 a.m. praying for mercy. In sobriety, I at least have come to accept that forces larger than myself will have their way with me in the world, and there's little I can do about it. It's not my fault. I am at God's mercy, and I find peace in that. But my relationship with fate has changed of late. I have come to believe that God will indeed take care of me and my problems. I now almost laughingly cast them over to the big guy and say, "Hey, this is on your plate now." I then roll over and fall blissfully back to sleep. My 14-year-old self had a far more vengeful conception of God, and I writhed around in bed until the sun was nearly up, and I had finally exhausted myself with worry and gave in to sleep. When I next came to, it was 11 a.m. and the sun was high in the sky, the air thick with humidity and pollen. I came down to the empty kitchen and started making myself a bagel. We had those frozen Lender's bagels in the freezer back then, and I could go through a whole sleeve of them in a single day. It felt surreal to chomp into that buttery mash of cream cheese and dough when I knew I really belonged in hell. Clearly, this was some kind of middle world, and the devil was on his way for me. Still, it seemed wild that reality could continue with so much normalcy, when we all knew the whole crazy Jenga was on the verge of collapse. But then, the phone rang. It was Peter. "Hey," I said enthusiastically as my lizard brain deployed its usual default upbeat social persona, the one I generally shared with the world. This, of course, triggered an identical reaction from him, and we had to dance our way through 30 seconds of niceties, all while my brain was begging for some sort of update. And then he was like, "I have some bad news." I couldn't even respond. I couldn't bear more bad news. I was barely keeping it together as it was. I just held my breath and waited for the next blow to fall. "Our car got stolen again last night," he harumphed sardonically. "Oh, wow," I said. And again, my propensity for social niceties instantly kicked in. "I'm so sorry to hear that. That's terrible." My brain filled with images of evil mimes swarming the Shannons' driveway, the warriors taunting them. "Thanks," Peter said. "It is terrible." He paused. A pretty good long pause. "But actually, it's not that terrible," he clarified. Again, I was silent, incapable of keeping up with the narrative. "You see," he began conspiratorially, "I rode around with the cops this morning, looking for the car." "Yeah?" I was imagining the horrible tension of sitting in such close proximity to our mortal enemy. It felt unimaginable to me, but Peter was clearly a cooler cat. "I asked the cop, what if the people who stole the car got a ticket last night?" Somehow I was still too asleep and traumatized to understand that in this hypothetical, we are the people who stole the car. I'm like, "Yeah, what would happen?" "Nothing," he said with giddy delight, and then marveled at my silence. I wasn't keeping up. "Don't you see, Nick? Whoever stole the car will get blamed for our tickets. We're off the hook." "We're off the hook?" I repeated slowly, still totally confused, still trying to process this radical reversal of fortune. "We're off the hook," he assured me. The logic of it all slowly congealed in my brain, but I still couldn't quite believe it. Just moments ago, I had been writing my own obituary, and here I was being told I would live. It seemed impossible. It seemed there must be some consequence. I zeroed in on the car. "Geez, well, I'm sorry about your car," I said. "Oh, don't worry about it. We found it. Whoever stole it removed the tags and ditched it in the woods near our house. It's fine." His mom hollered for him from somewhere else in the home, and he told me he had to go. "See you at school," he said brightly, and got off the phone. And that was honestly it. We suffered no consequences for our crime. Sure, over the ensuing years, we each racked up significant brushes with trouble, our behavior veering toward the erratic and destructive, but no one ever traced those missteps back to this formative event. The adults marveled at the continuing raft of auto thefts emanating from Oyster Bay, and I wondered at the nature of a universe that could let me escape consequences without demanding any kind of price. But it's actually not the end of the story. Years later, after I graduated from college and moved to Los Angeles to start a career in the film business, I went to visit my family during a long weekend. My mother and stepfather had left Locust Valley as soon as I went away to boarding school, and they had recently completed an even more wildly ambitious reconstruction project on an old plantation house in Albemarle County, Virginia. It was very remote, the kind of place you retreat to escape society altogether, but it was big enough to maintain an endless series of house parties, if that was what you were after. As it turned out, when I visited, I was not the only guest. Peter's parents were in residence as well, and every night we gathered in the library of the old house and got decently sauced before heading into dinner. I had by then developed a more collegial relationship with my parents. We had survived the worst of my youth, and we generally laughed when I came clean about the misadventures I had shielded them from. As the nights in Virginia wore on, I rekindled all the old affection I had for Peter's parents, this surrogate family that had taken me in and made me feel so welcome and at home when I was a forlorn tween. I was just at the point of sharing a laugh with them about the time Peter and I had stolen their car, when they actually brought it up themselves. They were still deeply traumatized by the whole ordeal. The pieces had just never added up. Why hadn't the police arrested those boys who stole their car? They had so many cars stolen that summer. Why hadn't the police connected the dots? And whoever it was actually knew Peter because they had given his real birth date with a different year. Mr. Shannon, it turned out, had to actually show up at the police station to deal with the citations. There were consequences of some kind for the officer who had arrested us, yet failed to bring us in. This episode, which to me had become a distant memory I looked back on with wry amusement, was still an open wound in their lives. I kept my mouth shut, shaking my head in sympathetic wonder that the system had failed them so spectacularly. And 6 months later, I was back in my hometown visiting my father. It was summertime, and lots of kids were home from college or home, licking their wounds after their first forays out into the real world. Late-night backyard hangs were breaking out all over the countryside, dewy youths drinking beer in their shorts and T-shirts. I was at one of these hangs when I ran into Peter himself. We hadn't kept in terribly good touch over the years. My heavy partying and hippie lifestyle made me feel like a pariah in my hometown, unwelcome in the preppy climes of my youth. I doubt that's true, but that's how I felt. We shared a hug and some laughs, and I told him how I'd seen his parents that spring at my mother's farm. I told him I'd been tempted to come clean about our car heist from the distant past, but I didn't because it was clear to me he had kept it a secret from them all these years. His face went deadly serious. "They can never know, okay?" he told me sternly, though he kept his signature twinkle dancing in his eye. He was skillful like that. I was dumbfounded. "Who cares, Peter? We were kids." "Dude," he insisted, "never." I couldn't understand it. I had told my parents about the time I snuck out of boarding school in New Hampshire as a teen and flew to Los Angeles. "It's different," he assured me. "You remember that summer? How our cars kept getting stolen?" "Of course," I said. "It saved our skin." He leveled me with a gaze, as if to ask if I was really this dumb. "Who do you think was stealing them?" And even at that point, I couldn't possibly imagine. "Matty McLaughlin," I proffered. Matty was a local bully who beat me up once at the hockey rink. Peter grinned. "Dude, it was me." Even then, knowing that Peter had gotten in trouble in boarding school for some academic malfeasance, evidence he was perhaps genetically inclined toward mendacity, I found it impossible to connect my choir boy friend from childhood to that wave of car thefts in the 80s. He registered my confusion. "Remember how I was dating Sage Riley?" I did. I remembered that. She had been in 9th grade when we were in 8th. Well, she lived all the way on the other side of town. So I'd wait for my parents to go to sleep, and then I'd take the car and drive all the way over to her place. I'd sneak in, and we'd fuck. I mean, I have to stop here. We were in 8th grade. I was barely jerking off, and he was stealing his parents' car on the reg to drive across town to fuck? What kind of sheltered life had I been living? I'd then fall asleep in her bed, he went on, and sometimes I wouldn't wake up until I could hear her parents downstairs. I'd have to sneak out her window and drive the car home. But by then, my parents would be awake too, so I couldn't just drive down the driveway. I'd ditch the car, sneak into my room, they'd realize the car was missing, and call the police. It was like the end of that movie, The Usual Suspects, when Kevin Spacey leaves the police station, and we realize he's Kaiser Soze. I stared at the bulletin board of our past, and replayed so many moments, seeing them now for what they actually were. How many cars had he already taken by the time we rolled my mother's XJ6 far enough from the house to fire it up that first time without being heard? How many times had Peter already driven the open road when I refused to drive beyond the border of our private lane? Was he laughing at me the whole time? At my innocence? My still undeveloped life experience rushing with my body to catch up with his? What did it feel like, I wondered, to pretend so completely to be something you weren't? To be a total imposter? I studied him in the evening glow, wondering who he really was as he flicked uneasily at some flaking paint on the picket fence in our friend's backyard. Was he a full-blown psychopath? Had he been that all along, or had something changed in him since those endless, innocent days pounding the buttons on his family's old-school pinball machine? Time had already creased his boyish face, and there was a confusion now dancing beside that old twinkle in his eye. So much of the promise of youth is, in fact, a hard, long slog through confusion and the unknown. You dress up in the costume of an adult and take your first tentative steps in hopeful prayer that no one will notice you're an imposter. What was adolescence, in fact, if not a posture? How could you possibly ever become a man without pretending to be one first?